Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very honored by the award of the Blue Planet Prize. And hopefully we can all work together, and I think we have to work together to create a sustainable well-being future. And I'll try to point out why and why it's so important. We live now in a whole new geologic time, the Anthropocene, because of the magnitude of human influence on the planet. I think the implications of that are that human influence is so large. You know, we live now in a full world, as Herman Daly, one of the previous Blue Planet Prize laureates, has said. I think the implications of that are that business as usual is really no longer an option. Our former ways of thinking about the connection between the natural world and the economy have to change. If we want to create a sustainable and desirable Anthropocene, we need to think and act differently. And I think the time is now really to take the opportunity to build economies and societies that are based on a new goal, on the goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature, and recognize that way of framing things, that it's not humans and nature as separate things. It's humans and the rest of nature recognizing the interdependence of the system and thinking about the whole system as one thing and our interaction with it, rather than the single-minded pursuit of GDP growth that's dominated our policy decisions up until now. So to create this sustainable well-being, I think we need to integrate these three elements. First of all, having an adequate vision of how the world is, our scientific understanding. And certainly we've been making a lot of progress along those lines in recent times, including the work that IPBES, I should say, has been making, assembling some of that research on the topic of biodiversity and ecosystem services, but we're also making strides in understanding the way the whole Earth system functions, but also the way what contributes to human well-being. The field of positive psychology, for example. What actually does contribute to well-being? And so we need to integrate all of those different components. And I think that's one thing that is still missing. How do we build this integrated understanding of the whole system? But we also need to have an adequate vision of how we would like the world to be. What are our goals for the future? How do we shift to this broader goal of sustainable well-being rather than simply GDP growth? But what does that world look like in detail, and how do we communicate it with everyone in society? How do we build a shared vision of what that world can look like? We also need the tools and analytical techniques that are consistent with that new vision, and I think that's going to require more systems thinking of the whole system and how all the different pieces are integrated and connected and how they function over time and space, and the ability to model those interconnections over time and space. And certainly we're making progress in that regard. But we also need new implementation strategies, including new kinds of institutions that can better handle our common assets, our natural and our social capital. And as I'll say, I think we're going to need some societal therapy as well to overcome the lock-in and addiction that we're currently in to the current system. So, on the question of how the world is, our scientific understanding, we know that the world is a complex, nonlinear, adaptive system. There are thresholds, there are tipping points, there are surprises. This is just a plot of some of the tipping points in the climate system by Tim Lenton and others. And you probably know about the ice sheets melting as a potential tipping point, but there are several other potential climate tipping points, like the Amazon drying out, et cetera. So we know that we have to understand this complex system for all of the complexity that it involves. We also know that there are planetary boundaries as they are a safe operating system space for humans on the planet. And this is the most recent version of this idea, which originally came out in a paper in 2009. But the analysis now shows that we're outside the safe operating space on 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries that have been identified. including climate change, biodiversity loss, land systems, fresh water, biogeochemical flows, etc. So, however, we know also that we're at a critical turning point in the history of humanity on the planet, that over the Holocene period, which allowed human civilization to grow, the climate was relatively stable. We're now in a period where we could go over some planetary thresholds and tipping points into this hothouse Earth environment, as it's been called, unless we take action to shift to a more stabilized Earth system. So we are at a critical turning point. We know that. We know the scientific policies. I think we know what the solutions are as well to help us solve these problems. However, that does not seem to be the movie that many people are lining up to go see. It's too easy to believe that things are fine, that we can continue doing what we're doing, that we really need to just focus on more economic growth, and that will solve all of our problems. These are inconvenient truths, but they are truths. So what do we need? I think we need a third movie. I think we need a new vision and a new narrative that recognizes, first of all, the embeddedness of the economy in society and the rest of nature. That recognizes that the goals really need to change to creating this sustainable and desirable future. But what does that future look like? It needs to stay within planetary boundaries, certainly, but it also needs to create the elements of human well-being and all of the things that contribute to that quality of life and well-being. And I know there's a Japanese translation for this that I think they'll get to. Evidently, well-being doesn't translate particularly well, but quality of life may translate better. Anyway, we need to stay within the safe and just donut, as Kate Rayworth has called it, where we're satisfying both of these things simultaneously. And that's what ecological economics has really been about from the beginning. It's really a transdisciplinary effort to integrate across ecology, economics, psychology, sociology, earth system science, all of those disciplines, toward these three integrated questions or goals. How do we create an ecologically sustainable scale? How do we stay within planetary boundaries, essentially? But also, how do we have a socially fair distribution of wealth and resources within the current generation of humans, but also between the current generation and future generations? How do we leave enough for the future? But also between humans and other species that we share the planet with. And finally, an economically efficient allocation of resources. And that allocation has to go far beyond the market allocation system to include all of the things that are not sold in markets, like our natural and social capital assets, the ecosystem services that you'll hear more about. So we need to include all of those things in how we allocate resources efficiently. Since the development of ecological economics, I think there have been several overlapping ideas that are essentially talking about very similar, if not the same thing. So you may have heard some other terms that I think are also contributing. The well-being economy, the circular bioeconomy, the regenerative economy. The Chinese are talking about ecological civilization. The donut economy that I just mentioned of Kate Rayworth. Herman Daly, who was a former laureate of the Blue Planet Prize and my collaborator on creating ecological economics, talked about the steady state economy, which I think we definitely need to get to. I like the Swedish term lagom, which means just enough, where everyone has just enough. So not too much, not too little, which embodies, I think, this idea of fairness, but also not in the way of sacrifice. So it's not like people are giving up anything, but we're sharing resources efficiently and in a way that everyone can achieve well-being and quality of life. A major contributor to this quality of life and sustainable well-being is this idea of ecosystem services, the benefits that humans derive from functioning ecosystems. This is a diagram from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005, which lumped these services into these 4 categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. Things like food and fresh water, the essential things that we need for our consumption, but also the regulating services like climate change, climate regulation, and flood regulation, and disease regulation. So there's a long list, and including cultural amenities for recreation, but also aesthetic and spiritual services, and all of the supporting services that allow those to continue, nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production, et cetera. And all of the connections of these services to the constituents of well-being, which are much broader and more complicated than simply the more we consume, the better off we are. So there's one thing missing from this diagram, however. I don't think these services flow directly to satisfying this well-being without the interaction with these other types of assets. And I think these are 4 basic categories of assets or capital that are, I think, required to produce sustainable well-being. And so in addition to our natural capital assets, you have to have individual people, our human capital, but not just labor, all of their intelligence, their health, individual health, et cetera. Our built capital infrastructure is what we normally think about as capital, but also our social capital, all of the interactions and institutions and cultures that are essential to produce well-being. And so ecosystem services are really the contribution in that complex interaction to producing sustainable well-being. And I think the challenge here is that this is a very transdisciplinary problem that we have to understand, not just ecology, not just economics, not just sociology, but all of those things and how they interact, and also a better understanding of what sustainable well-being actually means and how we measure it. So, and certainly IPBES has been contributing to that increased interest in the idea of ecosystem services and their contribution to human well-being. And we'll hear a lot more about that in the next talk. There's also the Ecosystem Services Partnership, which I helped to create, which is a global group of researchers and practitioners on this topic. And if you want to know more about who's doing what in the ecosystem services research area, maybe take a look at their website. There's also been a huge increase in academic interest and research on this topic of ecosystem services. So this is just the number of articles on this topic in Scopus by year. And you can see that there's now more than 6,000 articles per year published, and a total of almost 60,000 articles that have been published so far. So IPBES has a real challenge in synthesizing all of this stuff, but I think they're up to the task. Anyway, as was mentioned, the most highly cited of all of these papers is this one we did back in 1997, where we tried to estimate the total contribution to human well-being from 17 different ecosystem services across 16 different biomes. We came up with an estimate with a capital E that was larger than global GDP at the time. And we did get the cover of the magazine. That was great. But we didn't control what they put on the cover. And they said pricing the planet. And we really meant something more like valuing the planet to make it clear that we're not talking about market exchange values and prices. We're really talking about non-market or extra market contributions to human well-being, and that's where most of the value really came from. And that I think has caused some confusion, and I think there are some misconceptions about this valuation exercise that have been around for a while, and these are just 3 of them. That ecosystem services is sometimes thought of as an anthropocentric concept, that it's really just about what nature can do for us. And I think that's a misconception. I think it's really more about the interaction between humans and the rest of nature and how we depend on natural systems, but also how we impact natural systems. And so it's much more of a systems concept than it is a one-way anthropocentric concept. There's sometimes the perception that when you value these services in monetary terms, that's going to lead directly to them being privatized or commodified or traded in markets, et cetera. And I don't think that's the case. Those are two separate things. We certainly don't want to privatize many of these systems or services. And so that's something we should guard against. But I think the valuation exercise can help make people understand how important these services really are relative to other things that they also understand. So it's one way of communicating the magnitude of that contribution. Certainly not the only way. And I would certainly not say it's necessarily the right way. I don't think there is a right way, but there is a wrong way to do this valuation, and that's not to do it at all. And so we need to spend more effort trying to better understand and value these services. Sometimes there's the dichotomy put forward of, we can either value these services in monetary units, or we should think about intrinsic values. That's something that they're just should be preserved for their own sake. And I don't think those things are in conflict, really. They're quite complementary. Once you recognize that intrinsic values are not about valuation, about looking at relative contributions and trade-offs, intrinsic value is something that's more about the rights that we assign to natural systems. So it's more of a rights-based exercise. And I think both of those approaches are necessary and valid in managing our natural capital and ecosystem services. So, and also, I don't think we can avoid this valuation exercise, because every time we make decisions about these ecosystems in a world of trade-offs, we are implicitly valuing them. So, and I think there's a range of uses for this ecosystem service valuation exercise, including just raising awareness and interest. And I think the Nature paper and others have really contributed largely in that for that purpose, but also modifying and adding to national income and well-being accounts. How do we incorporate the contributions of ecosystem services into our national accounts? There's been a lot of work on that recently. For specific policy analysis for urban and regional land use planning. How do we create landscapes that really are the most valuable, that are contributing the most to human well-being? This idea of payment for ecosystem services, how do we use economic incentives to modify behavior in a better way? Full cost accounting. We know that the market is not telling us the truth about the true cost of everything we buy, because it's leaving out all these external costs and impacts on ecosystem services. And finally, common asset trusts. This idea of how to manage these assets as trusts that we hold, as systems that we hold in trust for future generations. There are some recent examples of trying to do this. This came out recently in Australia, that they're incorporating ecosystem services into their financial accounting and their national income accounting. There's the Ecosystem Services Valuation Database, which has assembled all of these studies that have gone on in the past, and now this is an open access resource, so you can go and look up the studies that have been done. They have over 10,000 valuation estimates for different ecosystems. We took an earlier version of that study and tried to use it to say, well, what has changed between 1997 and, in this case, 2014? And based on land use change over that time period and better estimates of the value of these ecosystem services that come from the more research, we estimated that we've lost about $20 trillion in the value of those resources between those two time periods. So there's been a radical decline in the value of those, largely due to land use change, desertification, loss of coral reefs, et cetera. That doesn't have to be the future. We can We can continue with business as usual and continue the degradation and loss of those systems. We can arrest that change with policy reforms, or we can make a great transition. We can reinvest in the management and restoration of ecosystems, the 30 by 30 goals of the Biodiversity Convention, for example, to restore ecosystems and their functioning, and to restore the value of those services and their contribution to well-being. That's the natural capital side. I think the social capital side is equally, if not more important. And we know we are also losing social capital. And because income distribution is getting more unequal, that's depleting our ability to build social capital. It's depleting our health. Our health and social problems are getting worse. This is a plot from work by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, showing the relationship between income inequality and a whole range of social problems. We know that GDP per capita contributes to, in this case, life satisfaction, one measure of societal well-being, but there are diminishing returns. It's very effective initially, but eventually it levels off. And so GDP is not the only thing, certainly, that's required. And then the contributions to social and natural capital become important. And we know that GDP was never designed as a measure of societal well-being. This is a quote from Simon Kuznets, one of the architects of GDP, who warned against using it for that purpose. And yet we have been misusing GDP, I think, as a measure of social progress for too long now. So it's time to leave GDP behind, I think, and to come up with better, more comprehensive measures of societal well-being. And there certainly has been a lot of work along those lines. This is just a subset of some of the alternative indicators that have been proposed, including ones that modify GDP, like the Genuine Progress Indicator. I'll talk a little bit more about this. Some that directly survey life satisfaction as a measure of well-being, and some that are indices of a whole range of different components, including the SDG indicators are in that category. The direct surveys of life satisfaction end up with results like this that show for each country the average score on a scale of 1 to 10. If you ask people how satisfied are they with their life, these are the results that you get. Japan is ranked not at the top of the list here. But I think what's interesting about this too is that they tried to analyze how much of the variation in these life satisfaction scores could be explained by these other factors, by GDP per capita, by social support, by healthy life expectancy, et cetera. And I just want to point out that GDP per capita, the yellow bar here, is maybe 15% of the contribution. So it's not nothing, certainly, but it's not everything either. There's a large fraction that's explained by other things, and they did not include in this analysis the contribution of natural capital. Another indicator that's very interesting is one we've worked with. It's called the Genuine Progress Indicator. It starts with personal consumption, which is a major component of GDP, but then it weights it by income distribution to get at the impacts of inequality on life satisfaction. It adds a few things that are left out, like household labor and volunteer work, very important things that are not marketed. And then it subtracts a bunch of things that should not be counted as positive. The cost of crime, the cost of family breakdown, a whole range of natural capital components, air and water pollution, et cetera. When you do that for a number of countries, we tried to assemble a global estimate. And this shows that since the end of World War II, GDP per capita has been going up quite consistently. GPI, genuine progress, leveled off in about 1980 or so, and we've moved from a period of what Herman Daly, again, has called economic growth to a period of uneconomic growth. So we're not really making genuine progress and have not been for the last several decades. We're following the wrong lead. So what do we do to create this sustainable well-being economy? Recognize anybody here? We need to break our addiction, I think, to this growth at all costs economic paradigm, to fossil fuels, to overconsumption in high-income countries, and to inequality. And I think we're going to need a therapy to do that, because we are addicted to this system. And that's going to involve creating a shared vision of what this sustainable and desirable future looks like. We've done some work working with psychologists about what we can learn from what does work at the individual scale to overcome addictions, and can we learn anything from that? And one therapy that seems to work quite well is something called motivational interviewing, which, instead of confronting addicts with the problem, which is usually counterproductive, it starts by engaging them in a discussion of their life goals. What do they want to achieve with your life? Once you've established that, then you can say, well, how is what you're doing now really helping to achieve that? And if not, how do you change your behavior? It can really motivate the changes that are needed. The obvious analogy at the societal scale is, how do we create a shared vision of the world that we want? I think the UN SDGs are a major step in that direction. But I think we need to broaden that discussion much more to the general public. We need to all think about, what kind of world do we want? This idea of scenario planning, it can be quite effective in framing that kind of argument. There are plausible futures that we can paint the picture of what those plausible futures look like, and then decide which of those we really prefer, and how do we get there. This is from some work of the Great Transition Initiative that have identified 4 sort of archetypical future scenarios. A business as usual scenario, a policy reform scenario, still both based on GDP growth, a great transition scenario, which is based on well-being and more focus on the community. The fact that we're all in this together. We need governance at many levels. I think that the SDGs fit nicely into that scenario. But I think we need to take it further and engage the public, because that kind of analysis and the policy sort of framework, I don't think engages very well with the general public. We need to paint that picture, I think, in better terms, using art, using videos, using games, using other kinds of techniques that can get people to see what different alternative futures could look like, and to build the shared vision around which kind of world that we really want. We've done some public opinion surveys in Australia to try and get at that a bit. The same basic scenarios, changing the terms a bit so they're not quite as value laden, so community well-being instead of the great transition. And we found that the vast majority of people strongly prefer this community well-being, great transition, SDG kind of world over the alternatives, although they think that we're headed more towards the existing business as usual free enterprise world. Some other surveys at national scales that I've come across recently, based on just 2 scenarios, the business as usual and the sustainable scenario, show that in almost all countries, this sustainable scenario is much more highly desired, highly preferred than the business as usual scenario. So it's what people really want in the future world. But the question is how to get there. And I think that's going to take some community and some movement building. It's also going to take some different kinds of institutions for how to manage our common assets and our common resources, like our ecosystem services and our natural capital. So we've proposed common asset trusts as a way to really effectively steward these kinds of resources going forward. Based on Elinor Ostrom's design principles for sustainable commons management, which start with the fact that they have to have clearly defined boundaries. I'm running out of time, I know. And one version of that that we proposed is to think of the atmosphere as a common asset that we should hold in trust for current and future generations, and use and begin to charge the 90 entities that are responsible for 2/3 of the carbon emissions, the fossil fuel sector essentially, for damages, put that into a trust and use it to undo those damages. And finally, we need to build a movement or a movement of movements. And that's something that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that I've been involved in helping to create is trying to do. How do we bring together all of these individuals, institutions, forces that are all thinking along the same lines, but have not been aligned together, have not been communicating? We need to build that critical mass in order to build the shared vision and use that vision to motivate the changes that we all need to help us get there. And these are just 3 recent books. If you want to know more about some of these ideas that I've been talking about, you can take a look there, and I'll end there. Thank you.